Alright, what's going on, guys? Alright, here we are. Essential movements, body work, or the axis concept. So what this means is you're fighting off of an axis. So this is something you hear. It's funny because I never really heard a lot of coaches talk about this thing. I would hear fight commentators, like when you're watching a fight, would mention it. But it's something I don't really remember hearing a lot of coaches talk about. And that is the axis concept, which is like basically fighting off the front foot or the back foot, okay? Now things are a little different with YouTube, and everybody's shared a lot of information, since YouTube's really gotten popular. But back in the day, this is something that you didn't really hear coaches talk about. You'd hear, fight commentators mention this. So what this means is you're fighting off of, you're leaning your weight to one foot or the other, okay? So typically when we're first taught, we get in our stance and our weight is distributed 50-50, and our head basically is straight up and down in one spot, okay? So this would be considered like the neutral axis, or the neutral plane, okay? So Kayden was a YouTube channel that really kind of breaks down this concept, and that's when I first really understood what this concept was. I think it was from Kayden videos, okay? So if you are standing like this, right, you got your head straight up and down, and what happens is, we're first taught this way, but there's no weight shift a lot of times when you're taught this way. You're taught to stand really straight up and down like this, and you push off for your footwork, right? Maybe even you pivot on your punches, right? You got your pivot going, but there's no real weight shift. And you can tell because when someone shifts their weight to one foot or the other, their head goes with the weight shift. It goes in the direction of the weight shift, okay? So you can see right there is, based off that little demonstration, that if you don't understand this concept and you don't really understand the weight shift, which, if you haven't seen volume 1, make sure you watch that video, because that's the whole point of this series, is breaking down all of these boxing techniques into their basic, most fundamental body mechanics. And really there's only a few of them, so if you could get these body mechanics down, when you get in your fighting stance and you start sparring or whatever you're doing, you're going to have an easier time learning new things, and everything's going to flow more smoothly if you get these body mechanics down. What happens is when you get in your stance and you're always stepping with everything you do, typically we're taught from day one, you learn your stance and everything is moving. And you never really learn the proper body mechanics. It takes a way longer time to learn these things from your stance moving around than to learn them standing completely square in like a neutral stance, basically a learning stance. It's the most natural way you can pretty much stand, and you learn these body mechanics. From this, you learn the body mechanics, the coordination, and the balance first, okay? That's the whole point of this series, is we're learning these mechanics, and we learn them from a neutral stance so that we get the proper coordination. And then when you get in your stance and when you do everything, your normal boxing routine, you're going to notice you feel more balanced, everything's going to be more smooth, okay? So when you're you're taught to stand straight up and down, and you never really learn how to shift your weight, that means you're not getting the proper power in your punches, but also your head stays pretty much in the same spot when you're punching, okay? So you basically become a very easy target for somebody who has a little bit more experience, okay? Okay, so what is body work? I believe I heard Coach Frolov from Russian School of Boxing channel call it this, and I just really liked it because it gives it a name. The axis concept, or fighting off the front foot, back foot. Those are other things kind of talking about the same thing, but I thought body work was just a really cool description of this concept, okay? So, what is body work? You got your footwork and head movement, right? So body work is kind of combining those two. right? So what I think of body work, it's basically using the front foot or back foot access to get an advantage, right? You use this to get an advantage on the opponent. You use this to be more defensive, right? So you think about it. When you're first taught, right, you see demonstrations all the time where a guy throws the right hand, and the person learning, he'll slip or roll over here. He does a big 90-degree pivot, and he throws like a 4-punch combination, while the demonstration guy throwing the punch just sits there and just lets all this happen, right? And I get it, you know, it's demonstration. It helps you get an idea for what you would do, but that's not realistic at all, right? Nobody sits there like this and lets you throw a 4-punch combination after taking an angle, okay? Even somebody with no experience, when you get off to the side of them, they instinctually will follow you or do something to not let you get to their blind spot, okay? So, that being said, to get an angle, to get an advantage on an opponent by taking an angle, has to be set up, okay? So if you look at someone like Lomachenko, Pacquiao, these guys are really good at getting angles, and they do it by throwing some straight punches down the center line to distract the opponent, and then they can take their angle, okay? Right, so getting an angle is not always an easy thing. It's usually a very subtle thing, okay? So this bodywork concept allows you to get an angle on a person without really moving your feet too much, right? There might be little adjustments, but for the most part, cool thing about this concept, it allows you to get an angle on somebody without a lot of footwork, right? So a lot of these angles you see people take, punching angles, it's a combination of footwork, but it's also body work. How you position yourself in relation to your opponent to give yourself an advantage, okay? All right, so learning this concept. We start from our neutral stance, right? Pretty much completely squared up. And like everything in this series, we focus on the weight shift, right? The foundation for a lot of our head movement, our steps, our punches. All right? So we just get used to this weight shift. From the hips, legs and hips, right? These little pivots are being caused by the turn of my hips. I'm not just pivoting for fun. This is part of the movement, okay? So to learn the bodywork concept, fighting off an axis, what I do is I shift my weight to the left foot and I keep it there, okay? So hang out in this position. You can see that you got some, right? You got all your punches right here, pretty much. Your head's off the center line, right? My weight is over my left foot. So my left foot's pretty much planted, right? We start this stuff stationary, but you'll notice I got this turn from my rear foot to kind of give me some more head movement, give me some more mechanics on my punches, okay? Boom, boom. So you hang out here for a little bit, and you shift over to the other foot. Same thing. We just hang out here for a little bit. You saw the jab series. We got this kind of running in place motion you can do. Boom. Okay, so once you get comfortable with that kind of movement, you can start from your neutral stance, shuffling forward, and take bigger, like wider steps. You can hang out on one foot for a bit, right? Go forward and backwards. Okay? So I'm still not completely thinking about my stance. I'm still working neutral for coordination, right? Okay? So I shift over to the left leg. I can shift over to the right leg. and go backwards. Right? Left, right. So you're getting used to shifting your weight and moving forwards and backwards, okay? Alright. So, once you can do that, those 2 drills, next you want to get in your stance, alright? So, you got your straight up and down stance right here, right? Your typical boxing stance. What you can do, lean forward a little bit, right? So you have to have a balanced stance. If you are two-bladed, this concept is not going to work, okay? If you're two-bladed, you're going to be too much, you're going to be twisting too much, and your feet are not going to be aligned properly. You're going to have no balance when you do this. And you're not going to get the proper head movement. Your head's not moving enough if I go like this, right? You can do the back axis pretty good from the, if you're really bladed. If you're two-bladed, you got the back axis, and you can dip from relatively neutral, but you're losing the front axis, okay? So what you do is make sure you have a little clearance here from your rear foot, right? Okay, so you gotta have this little clearance here. If I'm two-bladed, I can't kick my back foot forward like that. I want to be just enough so I can kick my back foot forward. So I get the benefits of a bladed stance without losing, so I don't lose the body work, okay? So from here, if I'm standing bladed, I just lean forward on the front foot a little bit, right? You see Floyd Mayweather do this kind of thing a lot, right? You see a lot of Philly shell guys. They'll do this a lot. But they're not always, you know, in the middle or on the back foot. They'll lean forward a little bit to bait. You got pullbacks. You got head movement. You can be really offensive from this position, okay? But from your regular stance, okay? You lean forward on the front foot. Takes your head off the center line. Squares up your shoulders more, but you have a lot of head movement here. It's good for moving forward. It's good for being really offensive, right? So when you throw a right hand, if you're good at the weight shift, if you throw a right hand, this happens naturally. So once you're here, if you're going to throw a combination, you have to basically do this anyways, right? So you get used to this position, right? Like I was saying, it squares you up, but it also makes you appear closer to your opponent. So what you can do is you can fake that you're going to attack. This is like a Lomachenko thing. Does this all the time. He leans in to bait, right? Then he can pull. Then he can counter, right? So this gives you the illusion that you're closer to your opponent than you actually are. Right? From here, leaning forward. Okay? So spend some time with that position. Practice it. And then the next one, from your stance, you know, you lean back a little bit. Now this makes you appear farther away. It's even more, it makes you appear more bladed sometimes too. Right? So from a kind of semi-bladed stance, you can appear more bladed just by leaning back. So this is good for moving backwards, right? You come up front, bait, and you can pull back, constantly pull back. So you're constantly moving away from attacks. Very frustrating for your opponent, okay? Boom. Right? And what else you can do, your head movement, if you're on the back foot, your head movement, you can dip, right? You can dip. Depending on where your opponent is, you can roll into the front position, and you can blend the two together, okay? So that's kind of the name of the game. You want to be able to blend these two concepts together. So like I was saying, if you're standing two-bladed, you're not going to be able to do the front foot axis. And another, if you're standing two-bladed, you're taking away too much of your right hand, right? You want to at least be able to throw your right hand right from your stance without having to set something up, okay? You know, boxing, fighting is very chaotic, and you're going to get put in positions where that are bad positions for you. So you need to be able to get out of those positions. You need to be comfortable fighting from all positions, basically. Okay. So if your normal stance is two-bladed, I think you're limiting yourself. So think about at least being able to throw your right hand, your back hand, right from your stance, okay? Stand just, turn your hips just enough so that you get to use this body work, right? You got more options, okay? Okay, so this concept also works if you stand super squared up, okay? So not a lot of people do this, but there are some people, like the peekaboo style, right? Super squared up. So right from our neutral stance, you take a half step forward. So now the ball of my trailing leg basically lines up with like the middle of my foot, right above my heel on my lead leg. So this just gives me a little bit more balance. And from the same concept, just by leaning from leg to leg, I get these big angles I can take on an opponent, right? Without even having to move my feet too much. Barely moving my feet at all. I take a little step, got a huge angle, right? You see the footwork video from this series, you'll learn these little shuffles, right? So a very squared up style is for pressuring forward. So you got to have this whole range of head movement to do that. Cut off the ring, pressure forward, right? Chavez Sr. is a good example of kind of this really squared up style. And he had great body work, right? He could get an angle on somebody without even moving his feet. That's the whole concept of this body work, this front axis, back axis, giving you the ability to kind of get these punching angles without really moving your feet, right? Okay, so if you're able to get these angles without really moving your feet, when you do move your feet, you're going to be even better at getting angles, okay? So this is really getting you more defensive, and you're basically getting more offensive as well, because all this head movement coming from these weight shifts and the body work, where I'm hanging out on a position, right? Makes it harder for my opponent to read what I'm going to do, right? You're on the back axis here, roll over to the front, back. So it's giving you a lot more options, and it's making you a lot more unpredictable, okay? You hear me talk about being unpredictable all the time, because that's the name of the game, right? Your opponent's going to figure things out, and if you can constantly be positioning yourself, playing with the distance, right? Appearing closer, appearing farther away, appearing really offensive, appearing really defensive, right? You're giving them different looks. You hear people talk about different looks. That's kind of goes right along with this. You're giving them different looks because you can do certain things from one position that are more difficult from another. Okay, so that's really the point of this, is you're getting more options. You're getting better at punching off angles, and you really can do it without having to do a lot of footwork, right? Your footwork becomes a lot more subtle because you have the body mechanics to get these angles with a lot less movement from your feet. Okay. Okay. So the slip line. So to practice this body work, fighting off the axis concept, good thing you can do is set up a slip line. Okay. Because the slip line is going to make it so that you cannot have your head straight up and down on that neutral axis, okay? So you get in your stance, more or less. You can be more squared up for this because it's going to really help you learn those mechanics, okay? You move get your left ear basically touching the slip line, right next to it. So if you notice, my head, in order to do this, my head is leaning over my right foot, kind of on the back axis, right? So you throw your punches down the center line, down the slip line like this. And when I cross the center line, I have to dip, right? So this dip is important because if your opponent's any good, he's going to know how to punch down his center line, meaning that his punches are going to get there, they're going to get to the target as directly as possible, which means they're going to be as fast as possible. It's going to be hard to see. So anytime you cross that center line, if you're moving your head out of the way, you're making it a little harder for him to hit you, okay? So you can slip, you know, we got the windshield wiper kind of motion. You can do that as well, but you want to combine that with these rolls so you're more unpredictable with your head movement, right? You can even dip straight down, right? And just by the nature of your steps, if you're using weight shifts for your steps, when you dip straight down, you might kind of get these little rolls anyways. But you can slip like the windshield wiper motion too. But for this drill, you can't really do that. This drill really just works on dipping your head off that center line, right? You can also put your arm that's closest to the line, you can kind of lift that up a little bit. Kind of guard that side of your body, that's the side that's facing your opponent. That's the side that's in more danger, right? I don't really have to worry about the left side over here. If he wants to hit that, he's going to have to throw a big looping shot, which is more of an opening for me, okay? So I'm taking away these straight center line shots, which means he might have to only use big looping shots, which is good. That gives me more of an opportunity to counter, okay? But that's why the slip line is so important. This teaches you about the center line, okay? You learn to punch down the center line and keep your head off of it, okay? So you can even throw these kind of crosses, overhands, and you know, you can have more fun with it. That's a whole nother video talking about that, but for now, just work on kind of keeping your head off the center line, working on your body work, and get this kind of front foot, back foot concept, okay? Okay, so just a quick note. If you're having trouble understanding this concept or what makes it different from head movement, think of it as body weight distribution, okay? So it's basically, how are you holding your body weight in your stance? Because as you can see from the demonstrations, if I lean over to the front foot, I get a little more square. It's more of a pressure fighter stance, okay? If I'm on the back foot here, I get a little bit more bladed looking, and this is more of like a, this is more like the old school boxing stance, okay? You look at guys like Joe Louis. They always had their head off the center line, right? So a lot of times they were on the back foot here to give them a more bladed kind of appearance, and it gives you, it's more defensive, right? Your head's a little bit farther away, you're off the center line. Any punch that comes at you, you can just dip, pretty much avoid any punch just by dipping, right? The front axis here, off the front foot, this is way more aggressive. This is for moving in, right? You gotta use your high guard here. You got both hands, right, ready for combinations. So if you think about the body mechanics of punching, right? When you throw a right hand, you bring your weight over to the lead foot, and you basically end up in this front foot position, right? But you can stay here, and you got all these punches, and then when you need to move, you can dip and roll back out to a defensive posture like this, right? So that was all without moving my feet. So when you start moving your feet and your footwork, that's when this stuff gets really interesting, right? But a couple things to make note of here. In a lot of these demonstrations, I might be doing a big shift like this. That's so you can see what I'm talking about. In reality, this can be a very subtle thing, right? So if you're a kickboxer, Muay Thai guy, you can still use this concept. It's just much smaller. It's a much smaller weight shift, right? So here I'm on the back foot. I just lean a couple inches. My head moves a couple inches over. Now I'm on the front foot, right? So if you're like a kickboxer or a Muay Thai, you can still use this concept, okay? Okay, so another thing about the punching, the body mechanics of the punches, right? When you're on the back foot here, you have a left hook. You can throw a left hook. You got your jab. You got your uppercut. Your body hook. You don't really have a straight right. To throw that, the mechanics of that punch, you can kind of, you can throw like a fake one, but it's not going to be very effective. To actually throw that punch, you got to shift your weight over to the front axis, right? So here, I got this kind of up jab. I got my straights. I can throw overhands, body hooks. I can even kind of throw a hook up here a little bit, but to throw a good big hook to the head, I got to shift my weight back over, okay? So when you spend some time in these positions, you get a feel for the punch mechanics and what's available to you, right? So you got to get to know these positions, and then you mix them together, right? Okay, so that is that's pretty much my philosophy on all of this, on boxing. I wanted to be a 360-degree fighter. I wanted to be able to fight and defend from any position I find myself in, and I wanted to use natural body mechanics, right? I didn't want to be, when you are in the super bladed stance, like I was saying earlier, you're taking away your right hand. And a lot of times we're taught what I call trainer stance, where they have you way too bladed, but then they got your upper body tilted this way so that you're still looking at your opponent. And they have you doing head movement here, which is not really effective, and you don't have good balance because you're standing too bladed. You don't have any of this front axis really available to you. You'd have to move around and kind of set that up if you wanted to use that. So what I was saying earlier is, I want to have natural body mechanics. So just bringing that right foot out a little bit. And now I have my right hand, I can throw it right from my stance. I got the front axis. When I lean on this back axis, I appear way more bladed, okay? It's a more defensive position, more offensive position, right? And you can blend the two together, right? So if you see my videos on What's Your Stance, the What's Your Stance series, I talk about this a lot. Okay? Everything gets mixed up. There's a lot of confusion in boxing, and I think because a lot of this stuff just all gets thrown into the same pot and mixed together, and they pull out random ideas and throw them all together, right? So like I was saying earlier, a lot of times when you're first taught to stand straight up and down, right? Which I get it, because you don't want to overwhelm someone when you're first teaching them. So you're taught to stand straight up and down, but you don't really learn the weight shift from this position. It takes a long time to learn the weight shift from this position. Another thing they talk about is sometimes they even have you have your back foot off the ground, which is a waste of energy. You don't need to do that, right? So if I'm from my fighting stance, what I like to use, which is semi-square, semi-bladed, it's kind of in the middle, so that I can use these both axes, right? If I lean forward on the front foot, my back foot comes up automatically. I don't do that for just because I'm told to. It's part of the mechanics. So I got that to spring forward. So from my fighting stance, without even changing my feet, I can lean forward on the front axis. And the toe, I come up on the toe of my back foot, right? And that's part of the mechanics of this motion, right? I'm not just doing it because I'm told to do it. And that gives me the ability to dart forward, right? But it also gives me the ability to dip back. I can pull back with these little half steps, okay? So if you've seen the volume on footwork, I talk about those half steps, right? So if I'm in my fighting stance and I lean on the back foot, for my old school kind of position, I'm flat on my heel. I'm not able to come up on, that would make no sense if I'm leading my weight to be up on the toe, okay? So I'm using the whole foot here. I'm lighter on my front foot. So I can sneak that foot forward, right? So the front foot is going to determine how close you are to your opponent. When I'm in this position, I appear farther away because my body and my head is farther back. But I can inch my front foot forward, and then when I lean forward to throw the two, now I appear way closer to the opponent. So this is that distance deception where this body work is so useful. Depending on how you hold your body, you can appear closer to your opponent or farther away. Okay? So you get this distance deception where I can appear closer or farther away without really changing my feet, right? And it gives me a better defensive position. Both positions are more defensive than straight up and down. Even though this is super offensive, my head's off the center line, right? So when you're throwing your combos, you don't want to be right here, throwing your combinations. Your head's right there to be hit. So when you throw your combos, the natural mechanic is to get on the front foot. So your head's off the center line, okay? It's another thing that you're taught from the beginning, from this straight up and down kind of thing. You do your head movement, you come right back to the center. Come right back to the center. You roll, everything comes right back to the center, okay? You're always there to get hit. Even if you slip one punch, you come right back up to get hit by the second one, okay? So from this position, I got these little dips I can do. I can roll back to the back position, right? I can come up neutral, and I can dip or roll. So I got these three kind of positions I'm playing off of. So my head's never really in the same spot. I'm always moving it around. And you get a feel for this when you learn to step with your weight shifts. All this stuff comes naturally when you learn to step with your weight shifts, okay? So that's why I'm always coming back to this. That's the whole point of the series. We're going over these essential movements, these basic body mechanics that everything is built off of, right? So like I was saying, everything gets thrown together, and sometimes you get a good combination, sometimes you don't, all right? Sometimes you're taught to stand like this, or you're taught to stand like this, but then they want you to fight like someone who stands like this, okay? So you want to be able to do all of them, right? Like I was saying, my philosophy being 360-degree fighter, well-rounded. I want to be able to fight and defend from any position, right? So there are a lot of great world-class fighters, world champions, but they might have only fought from one position, right? There's a lot of people that only fight from this front foot. You know, they got the toe up because they're leaning over the front foot and they're pushing forward, right? You got a lot of guys who are mostly back here, right? They throw bop bop. And their idea is to pot shot, long range, but you want to be able to do both, okay? So you get a feel for these positions, their strengths and weaknesses, and then you blend them together. And like I was saying, it eventually becomes natural because you're stepping with weight shifts. So wherever your weight goes, your head can follow. So you'll know which position you're in and what you can do over time, okay? But like I was saying, a lot of it comes from just learning these body mechanics, right? That's why this learning, the squared up stance is so important, because you get there faster, way faster, right? It can take almost 10 years to learn this stuff from your stance, especially if no one's teaching you this. Like, this is the stuff that's really lost, I think, in the art of boxing. For whatever reason, a lot of this stuff is just mixed up and lost in the art of boxing, okay? So this squared up, neutral learning stance, you learn these mechanics here, right? Like I was saying, you can exaggerate them in the beginning to get a feel for them, and then eventually they can become very subtle, okay? It doesn't have to always be a big shift. Just moving your head an inch or two is enough to get it off the center line at least. So if you throw something, you have the head movement already there. You already know where to go. Like if I'm in this position, I can dip down and roll to this position, right? If I'm over here, I can dip or I can roll, right? So when you combine that with your footwork, you're constantly trying to get your target on your opponent. And even better if you can get your target on your opponent to where his target's facing away, okay? So your hips, it's all from the hips. That's where your target is basically. I had one of my coach used to have me hold both arms out like this. You can get an idea for where your target is straight from your hips by holding both arms kind of out like this. All right, I got a jab, right hand comes right behind it like this, okay? Okay, and then one more thing to keep note when practicing this concept. You want to keep your back straight, okay? So you see a lot of people, especially you see younger Mike Tyson, and when he was doing his head movement, you know, he stands really squared up, and he was doing his head movement, and sometimes you would see his back kind of twisting and bending, kind of like a bobblehead, right? That's a bad idea. You don't want to be doing that. If you're really emulating Mike Tyson, that's okay. You got to understand how he stood, right? So you want to be squared up. You don't want to be trying to do that from a bladed stance. You're way too twisted. You're not using your body mechanics, right? So Tyson's style was very squared up. To get the most out of that style, you want to keep your back straight so you don't hurt yourself. So you take a stick and you can hold it down your back like this. So I'm standing pretty much squared up. My left foot's about a half step in front, like I said earlier. The ball of my right foot is about lined up with my heel, just a little bit above my heel for balance. So this is a squared up kind of peekaboo stance. And I'm shifting my weight. There's a slight bend in the knee to hold the weight. But I'm keeping my back straight, right? There's also a bit of a hip hinge in this movement, okay? Depending on how low you need to get, you hinge at the hip and you can add extra knee bend. But you want to keep the back straight, okay? So the hip hinge, I believe I talked about that in one of the earlier, maybe the head movement, volume 2 head movement, something like that, okay? So that's another mechanic that you might have to practice. Not everybody is able to fold at the waist like this. You keep your knees slightly bent, just slightly bent, and I get the movement from bending at the waist, folding over at the waist. That's called a hip hinge, okay? You might have to practice that. Like we spend so much time sitting down and not really using a lot of our proper body mechanics as we get old, okay? So that might be something you need to practice on its own. That's why it's part of the Essential Movement series, okay? So these slips that you get, yeah, it's from a weight shift, but you're also dropping your weight and getting a little hip hinge, okay? So that's another movement you might need to practice, okay? So go slow, use a stick, make sure you're doing it right, keeping your back straight, okay? All right, so that's Essential Movements body work. So it's the idea of keeping your head to one foot or the other, right? And you got to flow with it, right? This is not a strict rule where you only have to be on one side or the other side, right? But you flow between these positions, right? And you'll learn how to flow when you make sure you're stepping with weight shifts, right? So volume 1, the weight shift. A lot of these movements are coming off of that weight shift, okay? So when you learn to step off the weight shift, all this head movement and this body work, I get all of that for free. When my weight is on this foot, I'm over here my weight is on this foot, I got this position, okay? So we're flowing between these positions. So start shadow boxing, doing that. Try the slip line, right? Try it from your learning stance, you know, completely squared up. You're just shifting your weight, staying on a position for a little bit. Shift over to the other foot and repeat, right? Like I was saying, watch some Wilson Kayden. He's got videos talking about this. Distance deception. Really cool, really interesting stuff. But yeah, try it out. You know, work this into your body mechanics. I think you'll really appreciate how much more defensively responsible and how much more comfortable you feel in the ring when you can master this kind of bodywork concept where you're always thinking about getting a position on your opponent without having to do all this crazy footwork, right? You can do a lot of it just by how you hold yourself in relation to your opponent, okay? So try it out, like the video, sub the channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.